Okay, so let's go. So I'm going to talk about my professional practice and research in terms of measuring the performance of green spaces to support urban and landscape planning. And so I'm going to give, first of all, a quick overview of my professional practice, which was my departure point. So this was the first part of my career. So for almost 10 years, I was working as a landscape architect, leading projects, so building green spaces at different scales. And so I was aware of several issues that were creating difficulties in creating green spaces that could really have an impact in the quality of life of people. And that's why I decided to engage in research. And I concentrated my research in urban ecosystem services, and I will go into detail later about that. But also lately, in the last few years, I have been developing some work at the regional scale, analyzing landscape dynamics in a different way compared to urban green spaces. And so just to give you a quick overview of what I used to do before enrolling in a PhD and becoming a researcher. So I was leading projects, many public projects for green spaces, such as Parque Urbano de Passos de Ferreira, Centro Materno Infantil do Norte, which is a maternity health care facility in Porto, many schools. So I worked developing green spaces for several schools in the north region of Portugal. Of course, I had a team working with me to do this project. Hotel Casino de Chaves also was one of those projects. But even though I had the chance to do many different things and mostly interesting projects, I think that my daily practice was much more impacted by this this issue that I try to communicate with these two sets of photos. So I think that lots of people still think that quantity of green space is the same as quality of green space. So here in Portugal, we have this, and in many places in the world, this paradigm of green space that is aiming for a certain quantity of green space. But green spaces are not created all equal. So I also wanted in some way to go beyond greenness, like Diogo was saying earlier, but in a different perspective. I wanted to show that not all green spaces have the same kind of impact, and in order to create evidence to support different ways of designing green spaces, we have to measure what's happening in them. So in terms of creating meaning, as it was discussed earlier, but even so in more tangible aspects such as the ecological impact of those green spaces and the impact in health. So my approach in the PhD, which I enrolled in 2013, after working almost 10 years as a practitioner, my research focused on the impact of green areas in the quality of life in cities, especially the influence of the composition and configuration of urban vegetation in the supply of urban ecosystem services. Because I noticed in my professional practice that it was very difficult to talk, for example, with architects, with politicians, with engineers, and to communicate that we really need to have enough resources to create green spaces that have a positive impact. And many times what I was confronted with was with a kind of a sum of different patches of green that weren't going to have any impact in terms of health or in terms of ecological outcomes in the city, because it was not possible to create green spaces with quality. And also I was very interested in understanding issues related with environmental equity in the city related to the provision of green spaces. So here in Portugal, some of the challenges that we have relate to urban green trees. And like most countries in the Southern Europe, we have a culture of severe pruning, inadequate location of trees, and cultural practices that are not very good to create good outcomes in terms of ecological impact and also socio-ecological impact. So I've done some studies to understand this, but for example, in Portugal, Many people prefer to have very small trees in their gardens, or not at all trees, no vegetation at all. And of course, this will have an impact at the urban scale in terms of the delivery of ecosystem services that are provided, because actually the size of trees matters, because they have a lot of biomass in the city. So green spaces, as we don't have enough space to create green spaces everywhere, sometimes the tree, especially in build-up cities like, for example, Porto and other cities in Portugal, which are more Mediterranean-style cities. So many times trees are the main natural asset that we have in the city, and they provide a lot of biomass. And their size is very important because the leaves in trees are actually the factory that generates several of their more critical ecosystem services, particularly regulating ecosystem services. But people are not aware of that. And so I've done some research to understand what is the perception of citizens in terms of the ecosystem services that are actually provided by trees, so that we can also develop different ways of valuing trees in the city. And so one tool that I use a lot for my research and also for my professional practice as an environmental consultant was i3Eco. So I forgot to say that I still have one foot in research nowadays and one foot in the professional practice, because I work as an environmental consultant for many institutions, providing advice on how to analyze and promote ecosystem services at the city, or how to foster better landscape dynamics that may generate positive outcomes for the populations. But going back to i3Eco, so this was the tool that I discovered while I was doing my PhD. And this is a modeling tool that allows to use a lot of field data information to obtain very precise estimates on carbon provided by the vegetation in the city, air pollution removal, avoided runoff, the energy effects in certain types of buildings, and also some disservices or negative aspects generated by the vegetation, such as the emission of volatile organic compounds, which may actually worsen the air quality. And this is something that usually people are not aware, even technicians and politicians and people who are responsible for decision-making processes in cities. And this tool also delivers a lot of information about the structure of, for example, the urban forest in the city, and on the value. So it's possible to generate monetary valuations and other types of valuations, and to develop forecasts of evolution of urban green spaces in a certain study area along, say, a period of, for example, 50 years. And so this tool allows to develop many different types of analysis. And I'm just going to give you here a few examples so that you can understand what is possible to do with this tool. So it's a complex tool. I used to say that it's kind of like an Excel sheet in which you can do all sorts of questions. You just have to know how to insert the data in order to get the kind of results that will answer to your very specific questions. So, for example, one of the questions may be related to assessing the impact of quality in urban green spaces, which was something that I was trying to do in Porto, also the same city that Diogo has been researching in his PhD research. And for example, one of the things that I was able to discover and to communicate to decision makers, and they were quite surprised by these results, is that in Porto, around 60% of all trees have a low diameter at breast height. So this is a measure that we take around the trunk of the tree at 1.30 meters above the ground. And this is a very striking result, because in Porto, the dominant species are actually very large species like Platanus, Tilias, species that should be able to grow a lot. And at their full maturity, they could provide a lot of ecosystem services. But due to cultural issues, to planting the trees in the wrong locations, in Porto, trees seldom have the opportunity to actually grow to full maturity. So we live in a pattern where trees are usually cut down, chopped down, and then planted again, and then chopped down again and then planted again. And so they never have the chance to really grow to full maturity. So the potential to generate ecosystem services is quite low in Porto due to this issue. So we don't have a lot of green areas compared to other cities in Europe, for example. And even in the green spaces that we have, we are hampering the production of ecosystem services because we are not being able to take care properly of the vegetation. So I try to generate evidence to communicate to decision makers what is happening so that they can make informed decisions about urban green spaces. For example, I was also able to show them that large trees can have more than 100% leaf area than smaller trees. And this is very important because sometimes there is this kind of wrong idea that you can chop down a very large tree, and if you plant, say, 30 or 40 small trees, everything will be fine. And it won't, because you will lose the potential and the services that the large tree was providing, and the smaller trees cannot provide the same level of services. And even to reach something similar, they might take several decades before doing those or delivering those services. So it's very important to let trees grow to maturity. But you can also use this kind of tools to do analysis at the urban scale. For example, one thing that I was doing in Porto, and this is one of the papers that I published in my research. So I was analyzing the impact of the quality in urban green spaces in terms of different types of green spaces. So if we have different types of green spaces that are created with different designs, they are managed differently, I hypothesized that they would have a different performance in terms of ecosystem services provided. And I decided to use i3 to measure that performance and to understand which types of green spaces were delivering more ecosystem services. And so I don't have the time to go into details, but I found out that parks, public gardens, and woodlands were the type of green space that provided more regulating ecosystem services in Porto, together or closely followed by motorways and tree-lined streets. On the contrary, vacant lots and wasteland had the lowest performance in terms of providing green spaces, together with agricultural areas. And this has an impact in terms of environmental equity. So I tried to relate this information with socioeconomic patterns in the city. And I found out and was able to show to politicians and to decision makers that the wealthier areas in Porto, which are located in the eastern, in the western part of the city, these areas actually have green spaces that are more proficient in terms of delivering specific ecosystem services than the eastern area of Porto, which is much more deprived, as Diogo was also saying before my presentation. So here, the parish of Campanhã, even though having more green spaces in terms of absolute area or in terms of percentage of the parish, actually has much lower quality in terms of green space. So quantity here is clearly shown that it's not enough to provide ecosystem service. We really need to understand what is going on inside of those green spaces so that we can generate more positive outcomes for society. But also the same modeling tool has been used in other works. This is an example of a consultancy work in which I was involved, in which the goal was to analyze the impact of monumental trees. So Lousada is a municipality in Portugal, and they have been developing many different projects, very interesting projects. I think they are really very active in trying to value urban green space and try to make a stronger connection with communities. And so they wanted to develop valuation mechanisms for monumental trees. And so we used the tool to show to the population and to the politicians what was the value of each tree. And we combined many different indicators, not only regulating ecosystem services, but also other types of indicators more related to biodiversity, for example. And they were actually able to create a regulation, legal regulation for the municipality, which now enforces valuations mechanisms based on this study that we conducted together. And so here is a map with the trees that already have been characterized, and in lighter green you have the trees that have not been yet characterized but are identified, and so they will be characterized in later stage of the project. And then there are all sorts of things that we can also do. For example, I was involved in another project, a very known project in Porto, which has received international prizes, which was the 100,000 trees project for the metropolitan area of Porto. And for this project, the idea was to involve citizens in creating the urban forest of the future. And this is a way not only to create ecological value, but also to connect the communities to their green areas and to make them understand the importance of developing those green areas and maintaining those green areas. So this was a project that had several thousands of volunteers participating, so many hours of work, hundreds of actions that were developed involving both institutions and citizens. And in a time span of 8 years, 106,000 new trees, native trees, were planted in the metropolitan area of Porto. And I quantified the value of those trees at full maturity so that municipalities and citizens could understand that it is so important to preserve this investment, to take care of those trees in order that in the future they may be able to generate ecosystem services at their full potential, which is not happening, for example, in the city of Porto nowadays, because trees never get the chance, or mostly never get the chance to reach full maturity. And so this is some of the work that I have been doing with urban ecosystem services. I have been working also with Lisbon, Cascais, now Almada. Soon I will be working with Matosinhos. Also because the legal framework in Portugal for trees is changing and is creating new opportunities to work closer with communities and to involve citizens in developing useful tools also for decision makers. I also wanted to talk very briefly about one work that I developed in my environmental consultancy, which is the regional strategy for the landscape of Alto Minho, because I understand, as Agnieszka told me about the project that probably NeuroLandscape will be developing, that might also involve Alto Minho. So this was a work that was commissioned by the intermunicipal community of Alto Minho, which is the representative of the 10 municipalities of this region or sub-region. It's a NUTS 3 type of region in Portugal. So you can see at left the image, you can see the red. I'm sorry, I have my child here because he's ill at home. Gabriel, só bocadinho, tá bem? So you can see here in the left image. Sorry, are you, am I muted? Are you listening?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
sure.
Sorry. Because I heard a strange sound now. Sorry. Okay, so I was saying that you can see here. Thank you. I was saying that you can see here on the image on the left side at red. This is Alto Minho region, and then on right you can see the 10 municipalities. So there are two main rivers crossing the region. On north you have Rio Minho, River Minho. And here at the south part, you have Rio Lima. So these are international rivers. And so this is a very diverse region with a high diversity and quality of landscape types and natural values. You have mountains, you have the National Park of Peneda Gerês, a huge portion of the park is located in Alto Minho, and this is the only national park that we have in Portugal. You have marshland, I think it's how you say in English. You have coast, you have valleys, lakes. So you have many different types of ecosystems in this region. And so the intermunicipal community decided to develop this strategy so that they could understand better the natural assets that they have in the region, and they wanted to use those assets as a way to create a new paradigm to foster sustainable development and tourism in the region. And so first of all, they needed information about what exists in the region. So for example, when we started the study, there wasn't even an assessment of geological characteristics in the region. So we had to develop from scratch this map with geological information. We developed several layers of information. So this was a team that I was coordinating that involved many different types of experts. And I'm just showing here some examples of things that we have done. We also created a map with the delimitation of landscape units. So one thing that the SIM understood was that instead of using the administrative boundaries of municipalities, it makes much more sense to plan the landscape based on the biophysical and also sociocultural patterns of that landscape. And so they wanted an assessment of the landscape that could facilitate this type of new management or new landscape planning paradigm for the region. And this is actually something amazing because it's not mandatory in Portugal. So for example, in Spain, there is an example of a similar strategy of landscape that was created in Galicia, and it was enforced by law. But here in Minho, it was an initiative that was launched by the municipalities. So they want to do this. It's not something that they have to do by law. And so I think that the work went really well because of that, because it was something that they felt could generate value for the region instead of being forced to do something that they couldn't understand the value of. But what I wanted to show you here is how we have been able to assess the ecosystem dynamics with remote sensing data. So even though I'm a landscape architect and I'm very much focused on tangible aspects of the landscape, because even though I have done some work on analyzing the perceptions of people towards ecosystems or towards specific features of urban green areas, for example, I am also very interested in understanding what is going on exactly at the composition and configuration level of the landscape, because if we want to generate positive outcomes, we have to understand how shaping the landscape will affect the landscape and ecosystem dynamics. And this will involve not only socio-ecological transformation, but also ecological transformations. And there is a lot of work to be done in this line of research. So for analyzing Alto Minho landscape dynamics, we had an expert in remote sensing. And so just to give you some idea of the approach here. So you can see here on the left side, this image. So we had image taken from satellites, and for each image, each pixel inside the image would have a calculation of something that we call the enhanced vegetation index. And this index, it reflects how the vegetation in landscape absorbs differently the spectral bands in light. And so based on in this information, I'm not going to enter into details, but we can understand what is going on in the landscape across different time spans, and we can specialize this information very well. So you can see here in this graph that when you have vegetation at full peak of development, you will have higher levels of EVI, which is the name of the index. And when the vegetation is at its lowest development stage, you will have lower levels of this index. And based on this, we can use several images from several different months and several different days, and we can understand what is happening in the landscape in terms of productivity, in terms of seasonality. So, for example, when seasons are starting, when they are finishing, for example, how climate change is affecting those patterns. And we can also understand changes in patterns of phenology. So when leaves are appearing for the first time, when flowers are appearing for the first time, because these kinds of dynamics will have a huge impact in the rest of the ecological processes in the landscape, and also, for example, in other types of biodiversity. And we can compare what is happening across different years, because nowadays we have free satellite data for huge time spans. And for example, here in Alto Minho, we were able to assess a time span of 16 years. And we were able to relate our findings with dynamics related to fires, which are becoming much more common and intense in Alto Minho. It's quite a huge problem there. And we were also able to understand what is happening in terms of invasive processes, because invasions, biological invasions by several types of species, they have a huge sociocultural impact in the region, but also an ecological impact. And we are trying to understand what is happening. And so we needed some base information about the landscape dynamics. And based on this kind of information, we were able to derive indicators of landscape relative stability, which are very accurate and based on clear evidence. And so this was something that the whole process since starting this work at Alto Minho and delivering the proposal, it took less than 1 year. So it's not the same time span that we usually have available for research, for example, a research project or PhD project. We have to go much faster when we are working with local authorities or regional authorities. And so here we were able in a short time, in a short period, and for a very large region, to obtain this information that was critical. Here you can see, so the areas, the dots, more on the red tones, they are the areas with the lower stability, and the ones with the yellowish color are also areas with low stability, but not the lowest. And we were able to use this to propose a regional network of areas for nature conservation that is connecting all the areas classified in Natura 2000 wet network in Alto Minho, because the CIM wants to use this to underpin its new paradigm of development for the region. And so I just wanted to finish with some conclusions. So this was kind of a supply of urban ecosystem services in the landscape dynamics is highly influenced by composition and structure of vegetation. So I showed more work related with regulating ecosystem services, or ecosystem services more related with the ecological impact. But this is also true for ecosystem services, for cultural ecosystem services, for example. And I have also developed some work on that level. And so urban and landscape planning can have a strong impact in the delivery of urban ecosystem services, because if we are changing the properties of the landscape, we will also change the dynamics and the processes and the outcomes, and of course the services that they generate. And also evidence-based knowledge is crucial to guide decision-making processes. So I'm very much interested in bridging this gap between the research and the practice, which I think is very much needed if we want to have a positive impact in overcoming the challenges that communities are now facing worldwide.